Hello, Busy Bees. This is the Hive Live. I'm your host, Stacy Diggs, and today we are joined by Adam Long, Executive Director of Arkansas State University Heritage Sites, and Buddy Bradbury, docent at Hemingway Pfeiffer Museum. Hi, guys.
Good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm doing good. How are you?
Good.
Doing well.
Good, good. So we're going to be talking about one of Pigot's crown jewels, in my opinion, the Hemingway Pfeiffer Museum. And I had a really great experience going on a tour there very recently with Mr. Buddy Bradbury. He gave me a lot of in-depth information about the history of Pigot that I had no idea about. And we thought it would be great to share more of this information with the local community because Pigot has a lot of interesting connections to Ernest Hemingway, but also the Pfeiffer family has their own very interesting history. And so I thought we might start with who was the Pfeiffer family?
Well, the Pfeiffer family moved to Pigot in 1913. They were first generation German immigrants that lived originally in Iowa and then had moved to St. Louis. And Mr. Pfeiffer and two of his brothers had started a pharmaceutical company in St. Louis that did quite well. And they were preparing to move to the East Coast, move the company there. And Mr. Pfeiffer didn't really like big city life, and so he started looking to find a place to farm, to own farms. And on a trip to New Orleans, he ended up in Pigot when the St. Francis River flooded. Ended up in Pigot for about 3 days. Found a good deal on some land here. This was 1903. He bought 100 acres or so then, and then by the time the family moved here in 1913, he owned several thousand acres and eventually owned 63,000 acres here in Clay County. Moved the family here, rented out the land in 40 and 80 acre lots to tenants. And really, I think the what makes Mr. Pfeiffer and the Pfeiffer family unique is how generous they were with both their tenants and with the community in general.
Yeah, let's get into that a little bit further. I think that's a really interesting part of Pigot history because what was Pigot like prior to the Pfeiffer family's arrival? Like, how did they survive here?
It was basically a swamp dweller, hunter gatherer society. The land had been overcome by water during the New Madrid earthquakes of December the 16th, 1811 to mid-February of 1812. The New Madrid earthquakes, more than 1,847 tremors, had caused the land between the Black, the Cache, and the St. Francis rivers to settle, allowing the water from those three rivers to come in and overtake the flat land that lay at the base of Crowley's Ridge, a glacial deposit that was laid down at the end of the last ice age. And Paul, having grown up on farms as a youth, saw the great potential in draining this wet, flat land and reclaiming it as farmland, fertile farmland that had been underwater since then for 100 years. Calls upon the Army Corps of Engineers to come in and dig the slough ditches that we drive across every single day, and drain the water back into those rivers and establish the initial levees along the Black, Cache, and St. Francis rivers to hold that water out. And didn't insist, I suppose, but encouraged his farmers to produce cotton, and they produced more than 15,000 acres of cotton. This is very shortly after the Civil War. The plantations don't exist any longer because the money that they had amassed was Confederate money, and it's absolutely worthless. The workforce had been freed and was basically gone to free states. And Paul could produce something that was in great demand, cotton, and not being produced as it had in the past. So during his his time here, the St. Louis Red Mountain Texas Railway becomes the Cotton Belt because of the influence that he has over this part of the country, transitioning it from wetlands into very fertile, very valuable farmland, so much so that later in history, in the 40s and the 1940s, Eleanor Roosevelt will replicate this when she's looking for ways to put people to work and in homes. They'd been evicted from their homes by the banks on the East Coast during the Depression, October the 29th, 1929, when the Great Depression struck. People homeless wandering the land looking for some place to settle, and establishes the Wetlands Reclamation in Dyess, Arkansas, where Johnny Cash, Roy and Carrie Cash, his parents, will become one of the 500 families in that part of the country. So this whole socioeconomic strata of northeast Arkansas is transitioning in very distinct ways.
Yes, so there was a lot of undereducation and poverty, and going and hunting and gathering and such. And the Pfeiffer family came in and created industry that hadn't been here prior, and gave trades to people that they hadn't had prior.
Right.
Right?
An interesting fact about Piggott is that why, when we cross the railroad tracks in Piggott, do the streets change direction?
That is an interesting question. I've wondered that myself.
On this side of the square, it was the commercial side of Piggott, with the court square, the business section. All of the stores were built around the square, many of them by W.D. Templeton, the same gentleman, Buck Templeton, who built the house that the Pfeiffers will acquire in July the 4th, 1913, and move to Piggott. Quite a prolific builder. If the buildings have the tin ceilings in them, if they have floor-to-ceiling windows at the front, and if they have glass in the doors, rest assured that in Piggott, Corning, Rector, Pocahontas, Paragould, now I find, Mr. Templeton built those buildings. That was his trademark. But it is on this side of town that was the commercial part of Piggott. The other side of town is the industrial, believe it or not, 1,300 people when Paul came here. No sewers, no electricity, no running water, no paved roads. Living on a gravel hill surrounded by swamp water. But the other side of the railroad tracks was the industrial section where, because of him, 220 people in logging that logged for him along Crowley's Ridge, harvesting out red oak, white oak, black oak, hickory, pecan, black walnut, and cypress, will be turning that into lumber, axe handles, barrel strakes, railroad ties, shipping crates, hammer handles, putting many, many people to work in ways that they had never experienced before, drawing a regular income. What a concept. And so that was the industrial section, and bringing the cotton and some wheat. His farmers grew some wheat, I believe, into the railroad tracks, which at that time were, as best I remember, between 3 and 5 tracks that came right through the middle of Piggott, where the grains and the cotton will be loaded upon the trains headed south on this side of the river, Mississippi, and north on the other side of the Mississippi, as the arteries that move the industry in the United States are flowing freely. So it was because most of the trains traveled to the south, including passenger trains, that's all leading into the bins, the flat cars on the side tracks that are being loaded with bales of hay and cars of grain headed south toward New Orleans.
So they came from the city. So Mr. Pfeiffer, he Carl Pfeiffer.
No, Paul.
Paul Pfeiffer.
Carl is the oldest son.
Okay, so Paul Pfeiffer, who had just created this very successful pharmaceutical company, decided that he didn't want to live city life anymore after passing through here and relocated to Piggott, Arkansas.
And his two brothers continued with the pharmaceutical company and then moved to New York, to Philadelphia briefly, and then on to New York. And it continued to be successful. But Paul preferred, living in the country.
So how did the rest of the family feel about leaving the bright lights of the city to come to swampland, Piggott, Arkansas?
Well, I think we know the most about Pauline, the oldest daughter, who was, let's see, they moved here the summer after her senior year in high school, and so she was then accepted into the University of Missouri School of Journalism, and so in the early years she was, spending most of the year in Columbia, and then back here in the summers. And then after the time at Columbia, she got a job working for various magazines, including ultimately Vogue. And so she moved to Paris and was worked in the fashion division at Vogue in Paris in the 20s, which is a pretty glamorous job. She did not seem to take to small town life quite like the rest of the family did. I believe, though, that the rest of the family seems pretty happy with it.
Well, Mother Mary wasn't really excited about coming to Piggott, but as an Irish wife to a German husband, it was her responsibility. But Pauline is a Kardashian. Her daddy, when they left St. Louis, Daddy received $166 million as a buyout from his brothers Henry and Gus. Now, just on TV the other night, they were talking about the Anaconda mines in Montana, and the man that owned those was worth $75 million, and how amazingly rich he was. Well, let's just compare apples to apples here on this one, because Paul had $166 million. But Pauline was a young Kardashian who came from a very wealthy family and was not excited about coming to a town of 1,300 people in swampland. And so it is now that we meet a very important and exciting member of the family, Paul's youngest brother, Gus. We call him Uncle Gus. That's what the kids called him, and we affectionately call him that too, because everybody should have an Uncle Gus. When Pauline graduates from high school, Gus knows that her dad is bringing her to Piggott, and sort of to soothe over the wounds of leaving St. Louis, one of the largest metropolitan areas in the world, and coming to, moment of silence, please, Piggott, is that he gives her an endowment from which she will draw $2,000 every month.
That's a lot of money in the early 1900s. So-
Multiply about 21.5 according to the internet to convert it to today's money for pocket change, for happy money. It's a lot of happy, isn't it?
Sure is.
And so that makes her independently wealthy and able to sort of call her own shots. And as an independent young woman whose future is trying to be planned out by her family, they think by helping her out by, was it a cousin from California that they try to marry her off to? A Werner or a Ward? Ward.
Yes. Mercer?
Mercer, maybe it was Mercer.
Yeah.
A cousin anyway, a second cousin, which was kind of, look at Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. They were second cousins. Mm-hmm. And it was not that uncommon.
But she didn't take to the marriage with Mercer, I guess, because we know now that Pauline goes on to marry
Ernest Hemingway.
Ernest Hemingway. So,
But that won't happen for a little while.
okay, so getting back to Pauline, because I think she's a very interesting character in this whole, history of Piggott, right? Because although she wasn't here a super lot amount, right? She's like setting across, to other interesting
is.
locations. She's finishing up her degree. She's an editor for Vogue, but you were telling me that back during this time that women didn't get the credit for doing these things, right? Like, so she was kind of a shadow writing.
To the best of my knowledge, when she, her first writing assignment was as the editor of the Missourian newspaper at the University of Missouri in Columbia in journalism. She's the first woman to be editor of that newspaper. So she's broken her first glass ceiling for young women in a time when suffrage is on the march. And then she takes a job with the Cleveland Press as the editor of the night newspaper, the first one that everybody's going to pick up in the morning. From that, she goes to the Continental Telegraph in New York City, thinking that New York is more progressive, but it's the same stuff, different day. From there, she joins Condé Nast and becomes the editor and revives Vanity Fair after it had failed twice, being written and published by men about women and for women. Now she brings in 6 of her buddies, female journalists, and they revive Vanity Fair, and it becomes a tremendous success. And then Condé Nast moves her to the office as the office manager of Vogue in New York City. So this transition is occurring over a period of several years. But her name, to answer your question, will never be published in anything that she ever wrote for. She will only be identified, now you can correct me if I'm wrong, as a staff writer.
That is generally true. We have recently found 3 articles from the U.S. Vogue that gave Pauline a byline.
All right.
It was not standard though, so we have found a few. Now Vogue in Paris didn't give anybody byline, so it wasn't a personal thing for Pauline.
It was just standard operating procedure.
Yeah, they just did no bylines for. But we have found a few pieces very recently that gave her bylines from New York Vogue. So that doesn't change the point you're making, but it did excite us to find those. They're short pieces. One's about hats and one's about
gloves and scarves.
Yeah.
And thanks to a journalist who had written for Vanity Fair and for Vogue for 30 years, attending one of our writers' workshops, who, of course, was best buddies with the editor for both of those, a woman who had been editor for 30 years for Condé Nast. The journalist, and I don't remember her name, from Vanity Fair, had attended one of our readers' workshops and was instrumental in having the girls, things don't change sometimes, even if you've got a woman boss, having the girls research and bring us some of the information that came in to us. And so we're continuing to grow. We're becoming to more and more of an impact on history.
Another piece that's come up fairly recently is a short piece, a short story that she wrote for a publication called The Smart Set, which was a literary publication in the 1920s that a lot of the major writers of that period would be published in. And, that one came to us because more and more of that kind of stuff is getting digitized. Mm-hmm. And so we found it just through an online search of something that we wouldn't have even known was out there. So it's an exciting time because there may be so much more out there that we don't know about yet as things get digitized.
More history is getting uncovered all the time. Yeah. And it is an exciting time because we have access to all of these different pieces of that information so that we can create a complete and total story for these very interesting people that lived.
Right. But as historians, we have to be very, very careful. Google is a train wreck. And for every 12 people that see the same train wreck, there's going to be 12 different accountings based on your background of experience or what you expect to see. Doctoral students are told, be careful. Don't go out expecting to find something. You've got to, because you're going to find it if you're expecting to find it. What you're going to look for is the evidence, and then from the evidence, draw your conclusions. Don't draw your conclusion and look for the evidence to support it.
Right, and that's a really important distinction because ASU is really done went to great lengths to restore the Hemingway house to what it was, right? Like to the pieces that are in the house, and also providing historically accurate like information for what was going on during those times. So it is a really great slice of this time period that people can step back into when they go and visit the Hemingway
Yeah,
house.
and we have to be very, very thankful to the people of Piggott, to the volunteers. I did not come in until 2010, but this started about 1997 when the
Yeah,
museum was acquired.
That's when the ASU bought the property.
And the restoration began and continued for many years. But in '99, the opening of the museum on Ernest Hemingway's birthday, July the 21st, 1999, volunteers from the community had come in and stripped wood, had sanded floors, had worked many, many, many hours without pay at all, just to restore this in the hopes that it would become something. I'm sure that work, had it have been paid, would have cost a couple of $1 million or more for all the volunteer work that went in with it, supporting Dr. Ruth Hawkins and her dream. She labored for a long time at Arkansas State. You know this story more than I do.
And we should say also a thanks to the Janes family of Piggott, who owned the property between the Pfeiffers and ASU, that saved so much of the original historic furnishings. We have about 75% of the original furnishings, and some of those have come back to ASU since we've owned it, but most of them were saved by the Janes family, and if it wasn't for them, we would have maybe a restored house, but not the original furnishings.
And sometimes when people come here, they expect to see a rather grandiose house. Paul Pfeiffer considered himself a socialist, that more in philosophy than in politics, it was paying it forward. He had been granted the funds, the possibility, the resources to realize a transition of a people into independent, self-sufficient individuals that could be proud of who they are, maintaining their dignity. Everything was about maintaining the dignity of the individual. Any and everyone was welcome to dine at the Pfeiffer house during the Depression with open arms, regardless of race, religion, creed, or ethnicity. Every face is the face of God. Mary welcomed and embraced them all, fed them. Paul would send them to town with a chit to acquire anything that they needed to get them from where they were to where they intended to be, or to support them in times of difficulty. The farm families that worked for him were quite often benefacted by the Pfeiffers. Mary would buy the quilts from the Pfeiffers family, from the people here in Piggott. Made out of the flour sacks that were all done by hand and took many, many, many hours to produce. And it was not an item that was easy to give up. This had become, the quilts represented a montage of the family. Each piece of fabric that came from a flour sack had been worn by someone. And you remember who wore that. You don't have the photographs. You don't have the Facebook. You don't have the anthology of the history of the family. And these quilts, you would sit and look at those, and you remember who wore what, how old they were, what they did, what grade they were in, the fights they got into, the little blood spots, the repercussions from living in the country. All of that was significant, and to give one of those up was not a small feat. And so Mary would buy them for $15 a piece. When I first started, I believe it was around $550 a quilt that equated to, and now I'm sure it's more than $660 a quilt. Mary didn't want the quilts. She was rich. Everything was Irish white linen, and she could afford the very best. But that money bought the school lunches, bought the clothes, when school time came around, it bought the shoes that they didn't wear all summer long that they wore when they went back to school. It
Kept the people's dignity, so they didn't have to be just a handout, that they were providing something that was then being
A hand up.
valued. Yes.
a hand up instead of a handout.
Like, so you had told me something on our tour about how many times the Hemingway house had been painted. That was like another way that people had would come and do different work for the family for pay. Could you tell me a little bit more about that?
Well, Adam, you want to?
Sure. Yeah. So that when we were doing the restoration, we discovered that the house had been painted 47 times.
Wow.
And dating those, it seems that about 42 times were during the Depression. And so what we've learned happened is that when men came asking for work because they were out of work due to the Depression, that Mr. Pfeiffer would find work for them to do, even if it didn't really need to be done, such as, painting the house 42 times in 10 years, right? But it was a way that he could financially support the community, but as you said, do it in a way where the workers could maintain dignity and that they weren't taking charity, but were working for money. So he also paid men to dynamite out stumps from some of the land that had been cleared by the lumber companies, to clear land, and found other work for them to do as well.
So the Pfeiffer family came into Piggott and completely transformed the community because of their value system being one of like, we have this money, but this money is not just for us to buy all of the luxuries that we can afford. It's to come in and to help others as their religion and their value system, compelled them to do, right? So you had told me something else about the education that they would help people to afford in the area or to help them to gain access to. And I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit more about that.
Well, during the Depression, Paul considers two things in life essential: education and faith. And everything that the Pfeiffers did was based on those two things. As I understand it, the gazebo on the court square was built at Paul's pleasure because he found it convenient to stand up and orate on any topic that he felt that the people in Piggott needed to be enlightened on. He is the feudal lord that is bringing the money into the community that will funnel the money into the community, and the community will thrive and grow the time that he is here until he runs out of money. And as the money runs out, the people in Piggott begin to leave, and Piggott begins to wither away, and sort of the funding is gone. But it was Paul's belief that education being essential, that during the Depression, he made sure that the school district had the funding that it needed to continue as it had prior to the Depression coming, that salaries were paid, that the buildings were maintained. After all, the school physically stood right across the street from his house. Mr. Templeton, the builder of the house in which the Pfeiffers will live, had 23 children, and 17, as I understand, still lived at home when they occupied that house. Well, at some point in the day, you and the wife just would really like to get rid of them for a few minutes and send them across the street to go to school or whatever. And it became a social place for people to gather. Now, this is out in the country because Piggott basically ended at the post office. And it's a gravel road called Pfeiffer Drive that will come and circle the house. Paul, I've been told, sent farmers' children who understood in high school what they wanted to become, had a clear focus of what their destiny was, what would fulfill them in life. If they were conscientious and made good grades and focused on education and took it seriously. I've been told that he put them through Arkansas State University on the, which was Arkansas AM&N then, on the condition that they would come back to this part of the country and bring back to the community what they had learned in their education as sort of payback. And this will continue. I had a great uncle, Homer Wall, who had department store here in Piggott and Rector, and went on to Jonesboro to establish Wall's department store in Jonesboro. He will perpetuate this by putting Doc Brannon, a local dentist when I was a little kid, a cousin of mine, through college and put me through college, and some other people. And there were others, I understand, that did this because they saw the great value in the investment in the future.
Well, I think that that's a really good note to end on. I know we could keep going for a while. We were going to try to go for 15, but went for 30, so that works. But I do want to say the preserving of that history, it goes in so many different ways, and a lot of them that we're completely unaware of here in Piggott. Like there's so much that has been influenced that is still here today because of the Pfeiffer family's influence. And people can experience this piece of history because of ASU's preservation efforts. And could you tell me what the hours are and times that people can come and visit the Hemingway House?
Sure. So we are open Monday through Saturday, and we have tours begin on the hour from 9 to 3.
All right. All right.
And we also have, regular special programming that, offers opportunities to see the museum in new and different ways. And so, full calendar you can find at hemingway.astate.edu.
Well, wonderful. I hope we've just skimmed the surface. We haven't even got to Hemingway, who the namesake of the house is tied to. So perhaps we could do this again, and we can get into how Hemingway became part of Piggott's history.
Sounds good.
Yep, great.
Well, thanks for joining us, and thanks for listening, guys, and tune in next time to find out more about the Hemingway Pfeiffer Museum and about the history of Piggott. Thanks.